The morning they dragged Cora Whitfield's belongings into the mud and nailed the door shut behind her, the temperature in Boone Hollow, West Virginia, had already dropped below freezing. It was November of 1937, and the girl, 15 years old, barefoot on one side where her boot had split clean open, stood in the lane outside the only home she'd ever known, watching her dead mother's Bible sink into a puddle of red clay. The wind came down off the ridgeline like a blade, and Cora Whitfield did not cry. She had learned, in 3 years under Ida Pruitt's roof, that crying accomplished nothing except giving Ida another reason to call her weak. "Don't you come back here," Ida said from the porch, arms folded, her face the color of old paste. Behind her stood her husband Thomas, who said nothing. Thomas Pruitt never said much when it came to the girl. He believed silence was the same as innocence, and he had practiced it faithfully for 3 years, while his wife worked her dead sister's child like a mule. "The whole town knows what you are now. Witch, poisoner. I won't have it under my roof." What Cora was, in truth, was a girl who understood plants. She had healed Ida's own colicky baby with a tea brewed from chamomile and fennel seed, herbs she'd gathered from the meadow behind the church and dried on the windowsill of the attic room where she slept. She had eased old Mr. Suttles's joint pain with a poultice of comfrey root, applied with hands so gentle that the old man had wept and said she had her mother's touch. She had brewed a cough syrup from wild cherry bark and honey that half the children in Boone Hollow had tasted at one time or another during the long, damp winters. And she kept a notebook. Her mother's notebook, actually, leather-bound and soft with age, filled with sketches of plants and careful recipes for tinctures, salves, and syrups that Appalachian women had passed down for more generations than anyone could count. But the Reverend Amos Crane had called it witchcraft from his pulpit the previous Sunday. He had stood before the congregation in his black coat, his voice rising to the rafters, and pointed his finger at Cora Whitfield, as though she were a stain on the community. The Reverend's wife, Martha, had been suffering terrible headaches for months. Cora had treated her with feverfew tea and a lavender compress, and for a time the headaches had eased. But they returned, worse than before, and Martha Crane had collapsed in the general store on a Thursday afternoon, lying on the floor with her eyes rolled back while women screamed. It was a tumor. It would be discovered later at a hospital in Charleston that a growth had been pressing against Martha Crane's brain for the better part of a year. No herb on earth could have cured it. But the Reverend needed someone to blame. A motherless girl who talked to plants, who read books thicker than the Bible, who wandered the forests gathering roots while other girls her age were learning to keep house. She made an easy target. And when the Reverend spoke, Boone Hollow listened. One by one, the people Cora had helped turned their faces away. The women she had brewed remedies for suddenly could not remember her kindness. The children she had played with were pulled indoors when she passed. If you want to find out how a barefoot girl in the West Virginia mountains turned her banishment into something that would eventually heal thousands of people across 3 counties, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Cora Whitfield built inside a mountain became one of the most remarkable herbal medicine operations Appalachia had ever seen. And it started with nothing more than a dead woman's notebook and a stubbornness that not even a November ice storm could kill. Cora picked her mother's Bible out of the mud. She wiped it on her dress, tucked it under her arm, and walked north. She had no plan. She had no money. She had no food. She had the clothes on her back, her mother's Bible, and, hidden in the lining of her coat, sewn into a pocket she had stitched herself, her mother's notebook. 63 pages of plant remedies, written in Eleanor Whitfield's careful hand, with Cora's own additions crammed into every margin, the ink sometimes smeared where she had written by candlelight in the attic after Ida had gone to bed. For 3 days, Cora walked. The mountains rose around her like walls, their flanks covered in bare trees that clattered in the wind like bones. She followed creek beds when she could, because the water led downhill, and downhill meant valleys where the wind was less cruel. She ate what she could find, the last of the autumn's wild persimmons, wrinkled but still sweet, and a handful of black walnuts she cracked between 2 rocks. She found a patch of chickweed growing near a spring and ate it by the fistful. She drank from streams so cold they made her teeth ache. At night, she burrowed into piles of leaves like an animal, shaking so hard she thought her bones would come apart. On the 3rd night, she nearly died. A sleet storm moved through the mountains with the sound of a freight train, a roaring wall of ice that stripped the last leaves from the trees and turned every surface to glass. Cora, huddled beneath a rocky overhang, felt her body begin to shut down. Her fingers turned white, then blue. The shaking stopped, which she knew from her mother's notebook was a dangerous sign. Her thoughts grew slow and strange. She saw her mother standing at the edge of the trees, holding a lantern, wearing the blue dress she had been buried in, and Cora crawled toward that light. She crawled for what felt like hours, dragging herself over frozen ground, her hands raw, following a light that may or may not have been real. And what she crawled into was a gap in the rock face, a narrow opening, barely wide enough for a girl's shoulders, that led into darkness and stillness, and most importantly, out of the wind. When morning came and the sleet had stopped, Cora found herself inside the mouth of what the locals had once called Darnell's Hollow, a natural cave system that opened into a south-facing mountainside roughly 8 miles north of Boone Hollow. The previous occupant had been a man named Silas Darnell, a moonshiner who had operated an illegal still from 1915 until his death in 1920. The revenue agents had smashed his still and left the rest. What remained was remarkable. A hand-dug chamber, roughly 30 feet deep and 15 feet wide, with a ceiling high enough to stand upright, a natural spring trickling from a fissure in one wall, and a series of smaller chambers that Silas had carved into the softer limestone for storage. The cave was cold, but dry. It was sheltered from the wind, and because the entrance faced due south, the low winter sun reached several feet inside during midday, warming the rock walls enough that they radiated faint heat into the evening. Cora knew, with the certainty of someone who has always listened to what the land is telling her, that she had found her home. The first winter was brutal. Cora survived on foraged roots, burdock and cattail mostly, dug from frozen ground with bleeding hands, dried berries, and sheer stubbornness. She blocked the cave entrance with stacked stones and daubed the gaps with mud and moss, leaving a small opening for ventilation and a narrow gap she could squeeze through. She built a fire pit near the entrance, where smoke could escape through natural crevices, and she learned, through painful trial, which chambers stayed above freezing and which did not. She nearly starved in January. For 5 days she ate nothing, lying in the deepest chamber wrapped in leaves and old burlap from Silas Darnell's abandoned supplies, too weak to move. On the 6th day, she crawled to the entrance and found a rabbit caught in a snare she'd set and forgotten, a snare made from a strip of her own petticoat. The rabbit was frozen solid. She thawed it by the fire, cleaned it with trembling hands, and boiled every scrap into a broth she drank over 2 days. She would say later that it was the finest meal of her entire life. But even in those desperate weeks, Cora was planning. She had her mother's notebook, and she had a memory, At Aunt Ida's house, in a pile of old magazines used for starting fires, she had once found an article describing a pit greenhouse, a structure dug into the earth so that the ground itself provided insulation, allowing farmers in cold climates to grow year-round by harnessing the stable temperature just a few feet below the surface. She had torn the article out and hidden it in her notebook. The cave, Cora realized, was a pit greenhouse that God had already dug for her. When spring finally came, late that year, not truly arriving until mid-April when the dogwoods bloomed white on the mountainside, Cora began to work. She cleared the smaller chambers, hauling out years of debris, old barrel staves, rusted metal hoops, animal bones, drifts of dead leaves. She discovered that the deepest chamber maintained a temperature of roughly 55 degrees year-round, fed by the geothermal warmth of the mountain itself. The spring provided constant clean water, and the south-facing entrance admitted hours of direct sunlight during the growing season, creating a microclimate significantly milder than the harsh mountain air outside. Cora began transplanting. Armed with her mother's notebook and her own years of observation, she dug up wild medicinal plants and carried them back to the cave, roots wrapped in damp moss. Ginseng, with its distinctive red berries, golden seal, whose bright yellow roots treated infections, bloodroot, black cohosh, wild bergamot, echinacea, elderberry, yarrow, boneset, mullein, wild cherry. She transplanted them all into the cave's chambers, using soil carried in by the bucketful from the forest floor. She experimented constantly. Ginseng and golden seal thrived in the dim interior chambers where temperature and moisture mimicked their native deep forest shade. Bergamot and echinacea needed the brighter conditions near the entrance. She built shelving from old barrel staves, creating tiered growing surfaces that maximized light. She lined them with moss to retain moisture. She carved an irrigation channel from the spring basin toward the growing chambers, directing water with stone plugs. By midsummer of her first full year, Cora had over 40 species of medicinal plants growing inside the mountain. It was around this time that she met Granny Fay. Fay Mosley was 71 years old and had lived alone on the mountain above Darnell's Hollow for as long as anyone could remember. Her cabin sat on a bald ridge where the wind never stopped and the view stretched 30 miles. She was a Yarb woman, an herbalist in the old Appalachian tradition, someone who knew every medicinal plant on the mountain. She had known Cora's mother, Eleanor, years before, and when she discovered the girl living in the cave below her cabin, found her by following the smell of wood smoke, she did not call her a witch. She called her sensible. "Your mama had the gift," Granny Fay told Cora, settling herself on a flat rock near the cave entrance with the ease of someone who has spent a lifetime sitting on rocks and sees no reason to sit on anything else. Her face was brown and creased as a walnut shell, and her eyes were the pale blue of winter sky. "Not magic, child. Sense. The sense to pay attention to what the good Lord put in the ground for us to use." Granny Fay became Cora's teacher, grandmother by choice, and dearest friend. Over the next 2 years, the old woman walked down from her cabin nearly every day, bringing cornbread, dried venison, and knowledge no book contained. She taught Cora which plants to harvest under a waning moon, how to judge golden seal's strength by the shade of yellow in its root, the exact moment when black cohosh was ready for tincturing. She taught her to make proper medicine, tinctures extracted in corn whiskey, salves rendered in bear fat and beeswax, syrups preserved with wild sourwood honey. In return, Cora showed Granny Fay something new. She demonstrated how the cave's stable temperature let her start seedlings weeks early, showed her the irrigation system. Her method of reflecting sunlight deeper inside using broken mirror glass scavenged from an old dump site. "Well," Granny Fay said one afternoon, examining a shelf of thriving ginseng roots, plants that would normally take 6 or 7 years to reach maturity in the wild, but were growing nearly twice as fast in the cave's protected environment. She touched one of the roots with a finger as gnarled as the ginseng itself and shook her head slowly. "I believe you've done something nobody in these mountains has ever thought to do before." By Cora's 3rd year on the mountain, word had begun to spread, quietly, the way things travel in Appalachian hollows, carried on the tongues of people who walked ridgelines and traded news at crossroads stores. There was a young woman in Darnell's Hollow who could cure what ailed you. She had medicines for croup, for arthritis, for women's troubles, for the deep coughs that came from breathing coal dust. She did not charge money. She traded a jar of salve for a sack of cornmeal, a tincture for boots, a syrup for a wool blanket. People came. At first, 1 or 2 a month, climbing the steep trail with practical mountain skepticism. They left converted. A coal miner named Harlan Burke, whose chronic cough had kept him from the mines for 3 weeks, drank Cora's syrup of mullein, wild cherry bark, and horehound, and returned to work within 4 days. A mother from Cobb Creek brought her toddler, burning with fever, and Cora treated the child with elderberry syrup and yarrow tea, sitting up through the night until the fever broke at dawn and the little girl asked for her mama. Word spread faster after that. They started calling her the Mountain Doctor, though she was barely 18 and had never set foot inside a medical school. By 1942, Cora had expanded dramatically. With help from men whose families she had treated, she carved 2 additional chambers into the mountainside, bringing her growing space to nearly 1,000 square feet. She built a proper workshop near the entrance, a framed structure with a wood stove, a long pine table for preparing medicines, and shelves holding hundreds of labeled jars, each marked with contents, date, and recommended use. She developed a drying system using the warm-up draft through the cave's natural ventilation crevices. She could now produce dried herbs, tinctures, salves, syrups, poultices, and teas in quantities large enough to serve the entire region. The war years brought desperate need. With doctors scarce and commercial medicines nearly impossible to obtain in remote communities, Cora's remedies became the primary health care for thousands. She worked 16-hour days, rising before dawn to tend plants and preparing medicines late into the night. She trained local women in basic herbalism, creating a network of healers across 3 counties. She cultivated ginseng for its commercial value, using the cash to purchase glass jars, cheesecloth, brass scales, and books, always books. She ordered them from a bookshop in Charleston. Botany, pharmacology, agricultural methods, plant chemistry. She read them by lamplight, connecting Granny Fay's traditional knowledge with the science that explained why it worked. Granny Fay died in the winter of 1943, peacefully in her cabin on the ridge. She went in her sleep, and Cora found her the next morning sitting upright in her rocking chair, with a half-finished cup of sassafras tea beside her. She left Cora everything: her cabin, her 100 acres of medicinal-rich mountain forest, and 14 handwritten notebooks spanning 50 years of herbal knowledge. Cora buried her on the ridge where she could see the sunrise, and planted wild bergamot on the grave, Granny Fay's favorite. It was in 1944 that the past came calling. A delegation arrived from Boone Hollow, 3 men and a woman, picking their way up the trail with guilty expressions. Cora recognized Thomas Pruitt immediately, the man who had stood silently while his wife threw a 15-year-old into a November ice storm. They came because Boone Hollow was dying. Influenza had swept through, and with the nearest doctor 40 miles away and no gasoline for the trip, people were falling. 3 had died. 2 elderly men and a 4-year-old boy named Daniel, whose mother had carried him from house to house, looking for help that didn't exist. The Reverend Crane was bedridden, delirious with fever. They needed Cora's help. They stood before her workshop, people from the town that had called her a witch, nailed her door shut, and left her to die in a November ice storm. And they asked for her help. Thomas Pruitt held his hat in his hands and could not look her in the eye. The woman with them, a schoolteacher Cora vaguely remembered, was weeping quietly. She could have refused. No one on that mountain or any other would have blamed her. The people of Boone Hollow had stolen her home, her childhood, her good name. They had cast her into the winter like something worthless and never once sent anyone to see if she had survived. They had earned whatever suffering came their way. But Cora Whitfield was not built for vengeance. She had never been built for vengeance. She was built for healing, and healing does not ask whether the patient deserves it. She packed a crate with elderberry syrup, echinacea tincture, yarrow tea, boneset infusion, chest poultices of mustard seed and eucalyptus, and willow bark extract for pain and fever. She packed enough for 50 people, because she would rather carry too much down the mountain than too little. She walked into Boone Hollow with Thomas Pruitt and his delegation, and for the next 3 weeks, she lived in the town that had banished her, going house to house from dawn until long after dark, treating the sick. She treated the Reverend Amos Crane, who could not meet her eyes. She sat beside his bed and spooned willow bark tea into his mouth and placed cool cloths on his forehead, and the man who had called her a witch from his pulpit turned his face to the wall and wept. She treated Aunt Ida, who had aged terribly in the 7 years since Cora had last seen her, and who reached for Cora's hand with trembling fingers and tried to speak but could not find the words. She treated families she had never met, children born after her banishment, who looked at her with wide, trusting eyes and drank her bitter syrups without complaint, because their mothers told them the mountain doctor would make them well. She slept on a pallet in the church basement, rising at intervals through the night to check on the sickest patients, brewing fresh tea over a wood stove, measuring doses by lamplight. She taught the healthier women how to prepare the simpler remedies so they could continue treatment after she left. She showed them how to make steam tents from blankets and pots of boiling water infused with eucalyptus and peppermint, and how to recognize when a patient's fever had crossed the line from the body's natural defense into something dangerous. No one else in Boone Hollow died. On her last day in Boone Hollow, the Reverend Crane called her to his bedside. He was recovering but still weak, his face gaunt against the pillow, his eyes holding the look of a man who has been forced to reckon with what he has done. "I wronged you, child," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "I wronged you terribly. I knew it was wrong when I said it from that pulpit, and I have known it every single day since. I was afraid because I didn't understand what you did, and I was proud because admitting I was wrong felt like it would cost me everything. So I made you pay the price for both my fear and my pride." Cora looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Outside the window, she could hear children playing in the lane, children who were alive because she had come back to the place that had tried to destroy her. A dog barked somewhere. The late winter sun came through the glass and fell across the quilt on the Reverend's bed, and in that ordinary light, the old man looked very small. "I forgive you," she said, But I want you to understand something, Reverend. What I do is not witchcraft. It has never been witchcraft. It is paying attention. It is listening to what the earth is trying to teach us. My mother understood that, and her mother before her, and women before her, stretching back further than your church, or any church. You nearly destroyed something precious because you did not understand it. I need you to promise me that you won't let that happen again. Not to me, not to anyone. The Reverend nodded slowly. He had no argument left in him, and to his credit, to the only real credit that could be given to a man who had done what he had done, he kept that promise for the remaining 11 years of his life. Cora returned to her mountain, but the world had shifted. People from Boone Hollow began making the trek to the cave, not as supplicants seeking forbidden knowledge, but as neighbors. Some came to learn. Cora taught them freely, holding nothing back, sharing every recipe and every technique, because she believed that healing knowledge was not something to be hoarded, but something to be scattered like seeds. In 1946, she married a man named James Aldridge, a returning veteran who had grown up 2 hollows east and had heard about the mountain doctor from his mother's letters throughout the war. James was a quiet, steady man with carpenter's hands and a gentle way about him. He had seen enough of destruction overseas to last a lifetime, and what drew him to Cora was precisely the opposite. She was a woman who built things, who grew things, who healed. He saw in her not a witch or an oddity, but a woman of extraordinary intelligence and heart. On their wedding day, which was held on the ridge above the cave with wild flowers on the makeshift altar, Granny Fay's old rocking chair sat empty in the front row, with a sprig of bergamot on the seat, because some absences deserve to be honored. Together they expanded the cave operation further, adding a properly framed entryway, a classroom where Cora held weekly teaching sessions for anyone who wanted to learn, and a seed bank, a cool, dry chamber deep in the cave where she preserved seeds and root cuttings of every medicinal plant she cultivated, protecting the genetic heritage of Appalachian medicine. They had 4 children, 3 daughters and a son, and every one of them grew up knowing the difference between golden seal and yellow root, between healing and harming, between knowledge and superstition. James built each child a small garden plot outside the cave entrance, and by the time the youngest could walk, she could identify 30 medicinal plants by sight and smell. By the 1960s, Cora's operation had become something that no one who remembered the barefoot girl in the mud could have imagined. The Mountain Medicine Workshop, as it was formerly known, supplied herbal remedies to communities across southern West Virginia and into parts of Virginia and Kentucky. Cora had personally trained over 200 women in the practice of herbalism. She had written and published a book, a modest hand-bound volume titled The Mountain Healer's Guide, that was passed from hand to hand across the region until the pages wore soft and fell apart and had to be carefully recopied and rebound by the women who used it. The medical establishment regarded her with skepticism, and Cora regarded their skepticism with calm patience. She never claimed to replace doctors or pretended her herbs could cure cancer. She claimed only to supplement, to preserve, to offer what the mountains had always offered. When researchers from the State University came to study her operation in 1971, they arrived expecting folk superstition and found something that looked remarkably like a well-run pharmaceutical laboratory. The active compounds in her plants, alkaloids, terpenes, flavonoids, tannins, were real and measurable. Her extraction methods were pharmacologically sound. Her dosing, refined over decades of observation, was remarkably precise. They published a paper about her work and she read it with her glasses pushed up on her forehead and said it was nice of them to confirm what Granny Fay had known all along. The paper brought attention. Journalists came, and botanists, and a few doctors who had the humility to admit that a woman in a cave might know things they did not. Cora welcomed them all with the same directness she brought to everything. Here was her workshop, here were her plants, here were her records, here were her patients who could speak for themselves. She asked only that they represent her work honestly, without either sensationalizing it as mystical or dismissing it as primitive. Most of them complied. Cora Whitfield died on a Tuesday morning in March of 1999 at the age of 77. She died in the cabin that James had built for her on the ridge above the hollow, the same ridge where Granny Fay had lived, with the same long view of mountains stretching to the horizon, with her children and 11 grandchildren around her, and the smell of wild bergamot drifting through the open window because her eldest daughter had planted it along every path on the property, just as Cora had planted it on Granny Fay's grave half a century before. The mountain medicine workshop continued under her daughter's stewardship, and it continues to this day. Her seed bank, containing over 300 varieties of native Appalachian medicinal plants, many of them now rare or endangered in the wild, was donated to a regional conservation trust. Her teaching notebooks, 47 of them, filled over the course of a lifetime with the same careful handwriting and detailed illustrations that her mother Eleanor had used, were archived at the State University's Special Collections Library. And every spring, women from across the Appalachian region gather at the cave in Darnell's Hollow for what they call the Yarb Walk, a weekend of teaching, learning, gathering, and remembering the girl who was thrown into the cold with nothing and responded by growing a pharmacy inside a mountain. When you consider Cora Whitfield's life, what is it that stays with you? Is it the cruelty of a community that turned on a child because a frightened man pointed his finger from a pulpit? Is it the resilience of a girl who refused, absolutely, stubbornly, magnificently refused, to let the world's rejection become her identity? Or is it something quieter than either of those things? Something harder to name? Perhaps it is this: the knowledge that the very qualities that made Cora unwelcome in Boone Hollow, her curiosity, her love of learning, her insistence on paying attention to what others dismissed, her refusal to shrink herself to fit the narrow space the world had allocated for her, were the exact qualities that allowed her to survive, to build, to heal, and ultimately to transform an entire region's relationship with the natural world. Every one of us carries something like that, a curiosity that others find inconvenient, a sensitivity that the world calls impractical, a way of seeing that doesn't match the accepted view, a passion that doesn't fit the mold we've been given. Cora's life asks us a simple and profound question. What would happen if, instead of hiding that thing, instead of letting the world's rejection convince us it has no value, we dug into our own mountain and let it grow? If this story resonated with you, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. Because sometimes the most powerful act a human being can perform is to take the very thing the world threw away and turn it into something the world desperately needs. Cora Whitfield was not a witch. She was a woman who listened to the earth, and the earth, as it always does for those patient enough to hear it, answered back.